Hello, everybody. ODAT Nerd here once again with another long form, no nets attached video on Sublime Text plugins. This is going to continue the plugin that we were working on in the previous video in what has now become a series. But we'll talk about that in just a second. Now, if you watched that previous video, then the plugin that you're seeing on the screen right now will make some sense to you. But if you haven't, there's a link down in the description to the first video in this little series of live recorded videos where we pointed out the reason why this plugin was created and coded every line you see in the left-hand panel over here uh, from scratch and explained how it all worked. Now, as part of that video, one of the things I mentioned was that these two regexes here, which do appear multiple times in the file, once in the place where we look for tags and another in the place where we actually manipulate the file, were best placed up here in the top of the file as variables instead of being inlined, because if some problem was found with the regular expression, if it's only in one place as a variable at the top instead of in multiple places in the file, then modifying it in one place modifies it everywhere, and things tend to work a little better for you. But this isn't the only place these regular expressions actually exist, because remember, the first thing we did in the video last time was create the syntax that's allowing the tags in the pane on the right to syntax highlight the way that they are. And in fact, let's go ahead and view that file. That's the notes syntax in our user package. And it's a very simplistic syntax, and it looks like this. And the regular expressions here are very similar to the regular expressions that are here. There's a slightly different in that here we have to specifically look for only 0 or more spaces and tabs, whereas here we can look for any white space. And if you recall, the reason for that is that /s is any kind of white space, but syntaxes in Sublime match a line at a time. So a new line doesn't match /s, at least not at the beginning of the line, unless it's an empty line. Whereas in Python, the regular expression module would find that, and as a result, the regular expression for finding things goes a little doolally, if you will. Now, this all works, of course, but it does beg the question of what happens if what constitutes a tag changes? What if, along with word characters, uh, some other characters were also allowed in there that aren't otherwise allowed? In order to support that, the syntax would have to change. Then we would have to remember to change these variables as well. And we run into the same problem that we would have had if we hadn't put these regular expressions at the top. They're still in more than one place. Is there a way for our plugin to actually reference the regular expressions from the syntax to work? Yes, this is actually a very powerful technique in plugin writing, interacting with the syntaxes as they're defined by the syntax authors, because it allows you to work with things that you might not, have otherwise been able to work with. And case in point, down here on line 38, and this is a comment, and we can see that its scope is source.python comment.line.numbersign.python. Now on the face of it, the important part of this is the comment part, because that's what's telling the color scheme that this line should be displayed as a comment. But we could get more specific if we wanted to in our color scheme and say comment.line should be a different color than comment.block, for example, or doc strings. So document strings in your Python files could be a different color than regular comments if you wanted, and so on. Now that's just for color schemes. But imagine you had a plugin that wanted to find all of the comments in a file and erase them. You certainly could, if you wanted, say my plugin only works for Python files, and then try to figure out by looking at a file where comments are. But that seems like duplicated effort because the syntax for Python has already created knowledge of what's a comment. It's doing all that work for you. And what's better, if it was in a C file, it would also still be, it would be source.c comment.line dot slash or whatever, but it's still a comment. So if you were to create your plugin to just reference comments as far as the syntax is concerned, then your plugin would work with multiple languages and not just the one that you originally intended it for. And it also has the added benefit in our case of allowing us to remove this. Now, just as a very quick refresher on how this works, this find tags method at the top of the screen here is going to be given a view, which in this case is going to be this open file in the right-hand pane. It's going to find all of the lines that match tag line regex, which is lines 1, 7, 13, 19, and 25. That is lines that contain nothing but one or more tags. Then it iterates over each of those, extracts those lines from the buffer, and further refines, finding only the things that are tags in those lines and adding them to a list, which is then returned and sorted. Now, to be fair, this code is actually slightly more complicated than it needs to be, because if we wanted to, we could say view.subster and give it a region that encompasses the whole file. The problem with that is if the contents of any of the paragraphs contain something that looked like a tag, they would be found. So that's why we're not doing it that way, and we are finding the lines that we are specifically calling tag lines, which contain all of the tags, and then looking in those. Similarly, down here in this tag to top command, the actual core of the plugin, we are again doing a similar thing. We are finding all of the lines that match tag lines, only now instead of looking just for tags in them, we extract those lines one by one, find all of the tags in them, see if that line contains at least the tag that was provided, so we know if we want to add it to the list of matched items. And then this code at the bottom is responsible for grabbing the lines and the paragraphs that follow them and jumping them to the top of the file. So we need to be able to match two different things in order to remove these regular expressions and rely on just the syntax. We need to be able to know what a tag is, and we need to be able to know what a tag line is. And if we look at the syntax, what a tag is already well defined. That's what's making them appear red because of my color scheme in the right-hand pane. So what we really need is a way to tag to apply a scope, I should say, to the entirety of the line that contains a tag. Now, again, I am by no means a sublime syntax expert, but what I do know is that in this anonymous context, we can say metascope and apply a scope here. And I'm just going to say meta.notes.tag underscore line. I'm not going to hit save just yet. What exactly does this do? Well, here, this scope in this line says that when this text matches, this is the scope that should be applied to it. Similarly, up here, when the regex matches, captures says the first capture should have this scope. There could be more than one capture, which we could scope individually. You could also use capture 0 in here if you wanted to scope the entire match and then also apply additional scopes there. What does Metascope do? Metascope says that while we are inside the context that the Metascope is in, which is here our anonymous context for knowing that we are in a line that contains tags, apply this scope to it along with the other text. And in particular, it also matches not only the text that's matched inside this context, but also the text that was matched to put us into this context, which is this match here, which did the push. and also the text which makes us leave this context, which is this line here with the pop. Now this line is actually slightly different. I modified it behind the scenes between the last video and this one. And the reason for that simply is that originally it looked like this, which matches the end of the line. But just to point out that we could also add a new line in here as well as the $sign, specifically for this reason, and I'm going to explain that part right now, as a matter of fact. Now, if I jump over to this file, we can see, I'm going to space that out like so. Here, this is just a plain notes file. This tag has the entity name tag scope applied, as does that one, which is evident by the fact that it's red. The text in between them doesn't have anything special, and neither does this. But if I jump over to this pane and save the syntax as we see it right now, immediately when I jump over to here, now the text prior, along with the main file scope, also has meta notes tagline in it. The tag also has the meta notes tagline applied. The space in the middle does, but the character at the end doesn't. And just as an example, this paragraph text doesn't have it either. Now, if I was to jump back over here and put that line back and say that matching a new line or the end of line pops us out. Now, when we jump over to here, where previously this end of the line didn't say meta notes tagline, now it does. Now, is that important for us? In this case, probably not. But it's a good idea, depending on the language that you're using and the scope you're using, to get in the habit of that if the new line at the end of the line is important. Now, right now, it's not. It doesn't matter to us whether the scope at this position is considered a tagline or not. But it could exist for us in the future. We could extend this so that as soon as we add a hash, it would automatically pop something up to give us perhaps a list of tags that already exist in this file to autocomplete them. But you'll note right now, because it's the end of the line, it still has the meta notes tagline scope on it, even though it's not technically a tag yet. So we could create a snippet that triggers on that particular scope if we so cared. For right now, we don't. But that's just sort of a digression. I want to explain why I stuck that in there because I did that the other day, and I forgot to mention it in the video. Now with this, just this one simple change in the syntax, we now have the ability for the syntax to know not only the tags in the file, but also the lines that are tags in the file. And that's going to allow us to remove these things right here. They're not going to be needed anymore soon, but we're going to leave them in there right now. So the first thing let's do is replace the need for tag line regex. All right, and the first place that that is used is here. Now remember, what this function is doing is creating an empty set, finding all of the lines that match this regular expression, and then for each one of those, it extracts that line and tries to find the tags within it, and then it can return the list. Well, as it transpires, we don't need to do anything even vaguely like that anymore. Because the syntax already knows what's a tag. We don't need to look inside specific lines. We can just ask the file for that information. And the way we would do that is via view find by selector with the appropriate typing. And we're going to jump that over to here. Now this takes a selector, returns a list of regions, and it finds all regions in the file matching the given selector, returning them as a list. Now, let's close that. What exactly does that mean? What exactly is a selector? And that's one of those topics that we don't want to get into right now, but I'm going to demonstrate by saying view find by selector, and I'm going to choose the selector text. And what do we see? A region that specifies the entirety of this file. And I can also say text.plain and get the same result, and text.plain.notes and get the same result. Now, if we remember, the entire scope at this location is text.plain.notes, meta.notes.tagline, entity.name.tag. Each one of those things makes this scope more specific. And as we just saw in the console, text, text.plain, and text.plain.notes, for the purposes of this, are all the same. If this was HTML instead, there aren't any items in the list. And this is where specificity comes in selectors. But we can say if we want, find all the entities, and there they are. But those aren't just entities, they're named entities, and even more specifically, they're tags. So we want to use this, and this is finding all of the tags in the file just that fast with just that one line. And it's doing that by telling Sublime, hey, remember when you looked at this file and you applied this syntax? What are all the places where this scope applies? And it gives us that list. And with that information well in hand, if we, again, as I just showed, if this said entity.name.tag, then this list would contain, this would return a list containing all of the tags. So we could say for region in that, and we can say view.subster region. That's going to extract one by one the text of each tag. And then we can easily say tags.add to add that tag we just found to the set. We don't need to find all of the lines that match the regular expression. We don't need to iterate each of those lines and extract them from the buffer. And we certainly don't need to examine that line to find all of the things that looks like tags. We just did it in those two lines. That right there is enough to completely replicate the code that used to be here. And as we can see, it's still finding tags. It's still doing the exact same thing, which is exactly what we want. That takes care of that particular use. What about this whole command right here? Went a little far there. This is using a couple of regular expressions. This one's going to require a little bit more work on our part in order to get this working. But let's work it in a logical manner, if you will. The only other, this instance of tagline regex is the only one that still exists. So if we can replace this line with something, we don't need that variable up there. And as a matter of fact, we know how to do that because we can say tag lines is self.view.find by selector meta.notes.tag line. Remember, that's the scope we applied to that in the syntax. So instead of finding all the lines that match the regex, we can ask the syntax, what lines are tag lines? And now we don't need, presumably, this regular expression anymore. File still loads. We still get the list of tags. And if I was to pick tag 2, tag 2 jumps to the top. So no errors in the console. Plugin still works the way we want it to. This other part is a little bit more complicated because what this was doing, remember, is scanning over each of the lines that hold tags, figure out the region that is the tag line of tags following the current one, or just use the end of the file if it's the last item in the list, which is line 25 in our example. And then for each one, we have to extract that line. We need to find all of the tags in that line and see if the tag that we were provided is in that list, so we know whether or not we actually care about this particular line. Now, this still works the way we want it to, but we don't want to have that tag regex in there. So we need to do this a little bit differently. And what we can do is use regions. Now, if you remember from the last video and from just looking in the console just now, regions are a pair of offsets into a buffer, a start and an end. And one of the methods on a region is the ability to see if one region overlaps another or if one region is contained within another region. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to make a few changes here. Just referring to some notes in the other window here. We need first to extract all of the tags from that buffer over there. Now we already know from above that if we were to say self.view.find by selector and the selector was entity.name.tag, that would give us a list of every tag in the entire file. But we don't need every tag in the entire file. We only need the tags that match the tag that was provided. And what we can actually do here is use a function that's built into Python called the function, type and talk, a function called filter. Filter takes two arguments, the first being a function and the second being some list of some iterable list of items. And it steps through the array or the list that you provide it one by one, applies the function. The function is going to return true or false. The list that comes out is going to contain only those items for which the function returned yes. So what we can do is apply to this a lambda that takes a region as a parameter, and we can say self.view.substr r equals tag on the list of items. And if we were to do that, then the input is the list of all tags in the file, and the output is just the list of tags that match the tag that was provided, which is exactly what we want. And we also need to add that as a list, because the filter function actually it returns an enumerable object where every time you iterate over it, it finds the next item and returns it. And we want it to be just a list. So we're going to convert it to a list right now, and we're going to save it into a variable called tag regions because that's what it contains. And let's just tighten this up just a sketch so it looks a little nicer. And that's still working. And just for the purposes of testing, let's print tag regions because we want to make sure it's working okay. So if I was to look at that, I did the same thing I did in the last video. If I was to pick tag 1, we should see as a result printed to the console just 0,5 in a list because that's the only place where tag 1 appears. And that's what we see. And similarly, if I pick tag 4, we should get 2 items because tag 4 appears twice. And we do. So this is doing what we want. We can get rid of that print statement. We don't need it anymore. Now we need to modify this. We still need to enumerate the lines. We still need to get the region that follows. But these 2 lines are the lines that are changing. We don't need to extract all of the tags that are in the current line to see if they match. We just need to see if any of the tags that are in our list of tag regions is contained inside of this line. And we would say that by doing an if any of the following is true. If line dot contains R for R in tag regions. And if that's the case, then this region is one we care about. I'm going to go ahead and clean out that line too. That still works. So this is a comprehension that iterates over tag regions, and it calls line.contains for each one of them. Line.contains, and we can actually pop that. There's two of those. Region.contains is the one we're interested in. This one returns true if the given region is a subset. The documentation is not very clear on that, but if the region you pass is a subset of the region that is this is being invoked for, then true is returned, otherwise false is returned. So the result of this is comprehension that returns a list of true, false, true, true, false, whatever, however many tags there are, in how many instances of this tag there are in the file, that's how many items there are in the list. And this gives us a list of booleans of that number. The any function returns true if any of the items in that are true. So that's a very quick way to see which lines have the region. And if, a matter of fact, if I jump on over to here, let's just take everything back to the way we started. Can I still move tag 1 extended to the top even with this? Yes. And the console does not display any errors. So we have successfully, I think, removed all instances of tag regex. They no longer need to be there. And this no longer needs to be there. We've shortened up our plugin considerably, and now it works based purely on the syntax of the file and not on the regular expressions that we're defining ourselves. Now remember I said that one of the good reasons to do this is that your plugin will work with other languages without you having to do anything special. And if you're familiar with other syntaxes and how things work in Sublime, if you're more of a power user, you already know this is probably, as we've done it here, not a particularly good idea, and this is why. If I say scratch buffer, prompt for syntax, create an HTML file, and do this, when I execute the command, I get a list of tags in the file. Why is that? Because the scope entity.name.tag is one of the common tags that's used in HTML and other places. And as a result, our command is, as you can see, is automatically working in an HTML file in a way it wouldn't have worked before we started this video because it was using regular expressions. Now, of course, when it comes time to actually picking one of them, the status line at the end says HTML not found in this file. And why? Because the code in the plugin needs to see where the tag appears in lines that match meta.notes.tagline. That's not a standard scope, but it does mean that our command is at least possible to execute in a place where it doesn't make any sense. And this is where specificity comes into play as far as scope selectors are concerned, because we can see that this is a text.html.basic and then some more stuff and then entity name tag. Whereas over here on this side, this is text.plain.notes entity name tag, and there's some stuff in the middle. So what we need to do is make our scopes more specific so that they only match entity.name.tag when they're in a file that also has the scope text.plain.notes. Now there are a couple of ways to do that, and one would be in all of the places where we do find by selector, such as this one right here, we could say text.plain.notes here, and we could say text.plain.notes here, and we could say text.plain.notes here. and save the file. And now when we come to the HTML file, it says this file contains no tags down in the bottom, whereas over here, it still works in this file. Now the fact that it says, whoops, the fact that it says this file contains no tags is both factually accurate and a lie, because no, it doesn't contain tags the way you expect them to see them, but it does contain tags. So this isn't a particularly good way to pull this off. It's also kind of verbose. The whole code looks a little bit uglier as a result. So let's take all of those out. There's actually a better way to do this, and it's to add a new method onto our command called isEnabled. And that's going to take an argument of tag equals none. Now, isEnabled is a special method in a command class that Sublime will call in a few cases in order to determine if this command is actually enabled. Commands that are enabled can run, whereas commands that aren't enabled can't run. Additionally, depending on where that command exists, it may be invisible or displayed differently. For example, if a command is bound to a key and it's not enabled, that key does nothing. If a command is in the command palette and it's not enabled, it doesn't show up in the command palette because it's not anything that you can do right now. But if a command appears in a menu and it's not enabled, then it appears in that grayed out disabled fashion that we're all familiar with to tell you that this is something that could work but won't right now. IsEnabled has to take the exact same arguments that the run method takes, except it doesn't get an edit argument because edit is something that's specifically passed to the command to allow it to edit the buffer. And you don't need to edit the buffer in order to determine if your command can run or not. But this command does take a tag parameter, and so we are passing tag here. Now that actually allows us to make this command be enabled or not, depending on whether the arguments that has been provided to it. So for example, we could always have this command be disabled if the tag you passed was tag 1, for example, if for some reason you wanted to block anybody from moving tag 1 to the top of the file. That's just a simplistic example. The other thing that we could do, which is what we are going to do, is only enable the command when it's executed in a file that we know is contain notes. But you can also combine those and also only enable a command in a certain situation when certain arguments are present. That's something we can talk about in a future video. But for right now, we can say for this particular bit of code, we can say self.view.match selector 0 text.plain.notes. And just simplistically, match selector checks the selector against a specific point that you've provided and tells you if it matches or not. Now, in our case, we just care if the file matches. So any point in the file is either going to be text plain notes or not. So we're just going to pass 0 to there. But other things you could do is, we could have commands that are only enabled when the scope is entity name text.plain.notes entity name tag to make a command that only triggers when the cursor is inside of a tag, for example. But this change over here is enough to ensure that if we're in an HTML file, no matter how many times I push the button, we don't see anything in the status line because the command's not running anymore. But if we were to come over here, the command still works as we expected it to. And with that, we are going to call a close to this particular video. I want to thank you for watching this video, particularly if you also watched the first video. This video is about half as long as the first one. This is actually content that I intended to be in that initial video, but I ran out of time in the night and an hour was already too long. Now, I'd like to reiterate that my plan for the channel is to provide a series of videos that tell you how to do package development by going over topics in more detail. And in that case, those videos would be more produced than these ones. They would be edited and trimmed to remove some of my terrible mistakes and rambling. But I thought it was important to get these videos out, not only as practice to myself in recording and streaming, but also just to point out that even the best of us sometimes have issues that are vexing and simplistic. And that's not a reason whatsoever to be discouraged. This is, people tend to think, and I see this all the time in my travels around the internet, that working with plugins in Sublime is some sort of mystic voodoo black art that only the best of the best can do, or it's just too hard, or look at all of the information I have to know in my head in order to be able to create a plugin. And the simple fact of the matter is that is absolutely not the case. Having that information is important, but as these couple of videos, and I have a couple more planned in this particular mini series, if you will, of these live recorded videos, if they prove anything, it's that no matter how daunting you might think something is, it's still possible. The idea as a whole of how to create a plugin that moves the paragraphs to the top of the buffer may be beyond you, but note that I didn't start by having a finished result. I built up to it. How can we figure out what tags are? How can we see them in the buffer? How could we figure out what text spans? How can we remove that text? How can we move that text? And if you just build these things up step by step, it's a lot easier than you think it is. And that's why I wanted to, create these videos just to let everybody know it's possible. It's not as hard as you think. Problems will occur. Just think about it logically. You can do it. And I am here to help you. So if you have any questions on plugin development, anything you saw in this video or any of the other videos that you've seen on the channel, please hit me up in a question in the comments section under the video. You can tweet me at odatnerd. You can send me an email at odatnerd@gmail.com. Go to odatnerd.net if you would like other contact vectors to get in contact with me. You can even visit me on the forum and ask me questions if you want on the Sublime Text forum. All of the input that I get from users is going to help me guide and create videos that's useful for the community at large. And if you'd like to see more of these videos as they become available, please don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel and perhaps also hit the bell icon if you'd like to be notified by the gnomes of YouTube when a new video becomes available. And also, please, if you found the video helpful, useful, if it clarified anything, if you like what I'm doing here, throw a thumb on it too. That allows me to figure what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong so I can zero in on what everybody wants to see. But that is the end of this video. Thank you everybody for watching. We'll see you next time. I'll try to come up with a cooler catchphrase than stay sublime, unless that's not the one I used last time, in which case I've come up with two terrible catchphrases. Just in case I said, have a sublime day. We'll see you later.